Part 1. The Invitation. New Year's Eve in Willow Creek was always a quiet affair. Nestled in the shadow of the Blackwood Mountains, the town rarely saw excitement, let alone lavish celebrations. But this year was different. In early December, every resident received a mysterious gold-embossed invitation. The card was blank except for a single line in elegant script. Come to Blackwood Lodge at the stroke of midnight to celebrate the new year. The invitation had no signature, no RSVP details, and no return address. Blackwood Lodge, long abandoned, was infamous for its tragic history. A fire had gutted the property a century ago, killing its wealthy owners and every guest attending their New Year's gala. At first, people assumed it was a prank. But as the days passed, rumors spread. Some claimed the lodge had been renovated. Others whispered that whoever sent the invitation was offering a prize for those brave enough to attend. By New Year's Eve, curiosity had reached a fever pitch. Despite the bitter cold, dozens of residents donned their finest clothes and gathered at the base of the snow-covered trail leading to Blackwood Lodge. Among them was Emma Cross, a young journalist desperate for her next big story. The crowd buzzed with nervous energy. Emma's best friend, Jared, nudged her. "Tell me again why we're doing this," he asked, eyeing the dark woods ahead. "Because," Emma replied, clutching her notebook, "this is either the story of the decade or the start of a horror movie." As the church bells in town began to toll, marking the final hour of the year, a low, haunting melody drifted down from the mountains. It wasn't the wind or the trees creaking in the cold. It was music, faint but unmistakable. The gates to the lodge, once rusted shut, creaked open on their own. "Guess that's our cue," Emma whispered, heart pounding. She stepped through the gates, the others hesitantly following. None of them noticed the shadowy figure watching from the tree line, its hollow eyes glinting like polished obsidian. Part 2. The Ascent. The trail leading to Blackwood Lodge was treacherous. Icy patches glinted under the faint moonlight, and the wind cut like a knife, carrying with it a strange, metallic tang. The crowd moved in silence, their breath visible in the frigid air. Emma clutched her flashlight tightly, the beam slicing through the darkness. Jared walked close behind, muttering about how the whole thing felt like a setup. "Seriously, Emma," he hissed, "if this ends with some rich creep jumping out to scare us, I'm going to lose it." Emma ignored him. Her eyes were fixed on the lodge, its silhouette growing larger with each step. It loomed at the top of the hill, its pointed turrets and steep roofline jagged against the night sky. Despite its supposed renovation, the building looked wrong. The windows were dark, but every so often, Emma thought she saw movement behind the glass. The crowd thinned as they climbed, some turning back after losing their nerve. Emma counted only about a dozen people still trudging forward. Young couples, thrill-seekers, and a few older residents she recognized from town. About halfway up, the melody from before returned, louder now and more distinct. It wasn't just music, it was an old waltz, the kind you'd expect at a grand ball. The sound didn't come from any visible source. It seemed to drift through the air, as if the mountains themselves were humming a forgotten tune. "Does anyone else hear that?" A man in a thick coat called out, his voice shaky. "We all hear it," another replied, her eyes darting nervously toward the trees. Emma glanced at Jared. His face was pale. "This isn't normal," he said flatly. Before she could respond, a scream pierced the night. The group spun around, their flashlights darting across the trail. A young woman who had been walking near the back was gone. Her scarf lay crumpled in the snow, fluttering in the wind. "Where did she go?" someone shouted. "Maybe she slipped," a man offered, though his voice wavered. "No one slips without making a sound," Emma muttered. She scanned the woods but saw only shadows. The waltz grew louder, almost mocking, and the air grew colder. It felt as though the group had crossed an invisible threshold. "Let's just get this over with," Emma said, her voice firmer than she felt. She adjusted her scarf and turned back toward the lodge. As the group pressed on, Jared leaned in close. "Emma," he whispered, his voice trembling, "we shouldn't be here." But Emma couldn't stop. Something about the lodge called to her, and it wasn't just the promise of a story. At the top of the hill, the gates of Blackwood Lodge stood wide open, as if waiting to swallow them whole. Part 3, Crossing the Threshold. The gates of Blackwood Lodge towered over the group, their iron bars twisted into intricate patterns that almost seemed to shift in the flickering glow of flashlights. A plaque near the entrance, tarnished with age, bore an inscription: "For those who seek, enter freely. For those who fear, turn away." Emma's breath caught in her throat. She glanced back at the trail they'd climbed, now shrouded in mist. The waltz was louder here, its rhythm echoing through the cold night. It wasn't coming from inside the lodge. It seemed to pulse through the air itself, as if the music were alive. The others hesitated at the gate. "This feels wrong," a young man said, gripping his partner's hand tightly. "No kidding," Jared muttered, his flashlight shaking in his grip. "Emma, this is crazy. We should go." Emma ignored him, stepping past the gates. The moment her boots crunched on the frost-covered ground inside, the music stopped. Complete silence. She turned back to the group. "Are we doing this or not?" One by one, the others crossed the threshold, their faces pale with a mixture of fear and determination. Jared was the last to step through, muttering something about this being the worst idea he'd ever had. The lodge loomed before them, its once grand facade weathered but intact. The front doors, carved from dark oak and adorned with brass handles, stood slightly ajar, revealing only darkness within. As the group approached, the temperature dropped further. Emma felt the air grow heavy, as though the night itself was watching them. "Who even owns this place now?" someone asked, their voice breaking the tense silence. "Does it matter?" a woman replied. "Whoever sent those invitations must be inside." Emma placed a hand on the door. It was ice cold, almost burning her skin. She pushed it open with a low groan. Inside, the foyer was immaculate, as if untouched by time. A massive crystal chandelier hung overhead, casting fractured reflections onto the polished marble floor. Twin staircases spiraled upward, their banisters gleaming despite the supposed years of abandonment. "What the?" Jared whispered, stepping in behind her. "This place is pristine. How?" Emma couldn't answer. Her eyes were drawn to the massive painting above the fireplace at the far end of the room. It depicted a grand New Year's Eve gala in full swing. Men in tuxedos, women in glittering gowns, champagne flowing freely. The scene was vibrant, almost alive, except for one unsettling detail. Every face in the painting was turned directly toward the group, their painted eyes wide and unblinking. The room filled with a low hum, faint at first but growing louder. It wasn't music this time, it was something deeper, more primal, a sound that resonated in Emma's chest. Then the door slammed shut behind them. Part 4, The Grand Hall. The slam of the doors echoed through the cavernous lodge, making the group jump. Jared spun around, tugging at the handles, but they didn't budge. "Locked," he said through clenched teeth. "Great, just great." Emma's flashlight beam danced across the walls. The air inside was warmer than outside, but not comfortably so. It was stifling, like the atmosphere before a thunderstorm. "Look," one of the others said, pointing to a narrow table near the staircase. On it sat a polished silver tray holding 12 ornate masks, each one a work of art. Some resembled animals, foxes, owls, and wolves, while others bore human-like features twisted into unsettling expressions. Beside the tray was a handwritten note. "Choose your mask and enter the Grand Hall. Midnight awaits." "What is this? Some kind of twisted masquerade?" Jared asked, his voice laced with frustration. Emma picked up a mask shaped like a raven, its black feathers glinting as though real. She turned it over in her hands, half expecting something sinister to happen. But it was just a mask, or so it seemed. Only one way to find out, she said, putting it on. The others exchanged uneasy glances before hesitantly choosing their masks. Jared selected a wolf, grumbling under his breath. As each person donned their mask, the low hum in the lodge grew louder, vibrating through the floor. A sudden creak drew their attention to a pair of double doors at the far end of the foyer. They swung open slowly, revealing a grand hall illuminated by hundreds of candles. The room was breathtaking. A long banquet table stretched down the center, adorned with crystal goblets and platters of decadent food. The walls were lined with gilded mirrors, reflecting the flickering candlelight. But the most striking feature was the crowd. Hundreds of elegantly dressed figures filled the hall, dancing and mingling as though this were the most magnificent party in the world. "Where did they come from?" a woman whispered. Emma stepped closer, her stomach tightening. Something about the guests was off. Their movements were fluid, almost too perfect, and their faces were obscured by masks similar to the ones the group had chosen. "They don't seem real," Jared muttered. Emma approached the nearest figure, a tall man in a black suit wearing a mask shaped like a stag. "Excuse me," she said cautiously, but he didn't respond. He simply turned his masked face toward her, his posture unnervingly rigid. Before Emma could say more, the clock at the far end of the hall began to chime. Dong. The sound reverberated through the room, freezing every masked guest in place. Dong. The group huddled together as the air grew thick and oppressive. Dong. The final chime struck, and every masked figure in the hall turned to face them in unison. Their movements were sharp now, unnatural, and their empty eye sockets glowed faintly behind their masks. "Welcome," a deep, otherworldly voice boomed. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You are the honored guests of the hour. Midnight is here, and the real celebration begins." The doors to the hall slammed shut, sealing them inside. Part 5. The dance begins. The air in the grand hall turned icy as the masked figures closed in. Their movements were unnervingly synchronized, their heads tilting in unison as though studying the group. "Okay, this is officially a nightmare," Jared whispered, his mask doing little to hide the panic in his voice. Emma's heart pounded, but she forced herself to step forward. "Who invited us here?" she demanded, her voice echoing in the cavernous hall. "What do you want?" The deep voice boomed again, reverberating through the walls. "You accepted the invitation. Now, you must play the game." "Game?" Emma asked, her voice trembling despite her best efforts. The figure in the stag mask stepped forward, moving with a stiff elegance. From behind his back, he produced a silver pocket watch and held it aloft. "When the clock strikes 1, the voice continued, "only those who have danced will remain. Refuse and the lodge will claim you." "What does that even mean?" Jared snapped. "Claim us? Is this some kind of sick joke?" The stag-masked figure snapped the watch shut, and the music started again. A haunting waltz that filled the hall like a rising tide. The masked guests resumed their fluid movements, pairing off to dance across the floor. Emma felt an invisible pull, her feet edging forward against her will. Around her, the others began to stumble forward too, their protests stifled as though the air had stolen their voices. "What's happening?" a woman cried, clutching at her mask. One of the masked dancers glided toward Emma, extending a gloved hand. The figure's face was shrouded in a fox mask, but the faint glow of empty sockets behind it made Emma recoil. "I'm not doing this," Jared growled, backing away. But as he did, one of the mirrors on the wall shattered, its shards slicing through the air like glass blades. Emma grabbed his arm. "We don't have a choice." The others began to pair off reluctantly, the waltz growing louder, more insistent. Emma hesitated only a moment before taking the fox-masked figure's hand. The touch was cold and brittle, like grasping a porcelain doll. The dance began. The masked figure led Emma across the floor with unnatural precision. It wasn't like a normal dance. The steps felt foreign, as though her body moved to an ancient rhythm she didn't recognize. Around her, the others struggled to keep up, their movements stiff and panicked. Jared was paired with a masked figure in a long black gown. He looked at Emma, his eyes wide with fear, as the figure forced him into the steps of the waltz. The longer they danced, the stranger the room became. The gilded mirrors began to ripple like water, their reflections twisting into grotesque, nightmarish images. The masked figures grew more aggressive, pulling their partners closer, their glowing sockets drilling into their prey. Emma tried to pull away, but the fox-masked figure's grip tightened. "Let go!" she shouted, struggling to break free. The figure's head tilted, its mask cracking slightly to reveal a hint of something dark and rotted beneath. Its hollow voice rasped, "You cannot leave. Not yet." As the clock in the hall began to tick closer to 1, the air grew heavier. The masked figures moved faster, their steps frantic and wild, dragging the group deeper into their macabre dance. Emma's vision blurred, her body moving against her will. Over the pounding waltz, she heard Jared's voice shouting her name, but it sounded distant, as though he were underwater. When the clock struck 1, the room erupted in a blinding flash of light, and then everything went dark. Part 6, the first to fall. The darkness was suffocating. Emma blinked furiously, trying to adjust, but the grand hall had vanished. She felt weightless, suspended in a void. "Jared," she called out, her voice echoing strangely. "Is anyone here?" A flicker of light appeared ahead, faint and trembling, like a candle struggling against the wind. As Emma moved toward it, the floor reappeared beneath her feet, hardwood, polished to a mirror shine. She wasn't alone. The group was scattered across the room, each person dazed and clutching their masks. The haunting waltz was gone, replaced by an oppressive silence. "Emma!" Jared's voice cut through the quiet, and she spun to see him rushing toward her. His wolf mask dangled from his hand, his face pale. "What just happened? Where are we?" Emma scanned the room. It looked like the grand hall, but the details were wrong. The walls were covered in dark, pulsating veins that seemed to breathe, and the gilded mirrors now reflected nothing but shadows. "We're still in the lodge," Emma said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it's different." A sharp cry drew their attention. One of the group, a man in his 30s, was frantically pulling at his mask. "It won't come off!" he shouted, his fingers clawing at the edges. Others began to panic, trying to remove their masks as well, but they wouldn't budge. The ornate designs seemed fused to their faces, as though the masks had become part of them. Emma reached up to her own mask, but she hesitated. Her gut told her the same fate awaited her if she tried to remove it. "Stop!" she shouted. "Pulling at them isn't helping." The man ignored her, yanking harder at his mask. With a sickening crack, the mask splintered, and he collapsed to the floor. The group gasped as the man's body convulsed violently. His limbs twisted at unnatural angles, his skin growing pale and taut. When he finally stilled, he wasn't the same. He sat up slowly, his head tilting in a jerky motion. His eyes glowed faintly behind the shattered remains of his mask, and when he opened his mouth, a guttural rasp escaped. He's one of them," a woman screamed, backing away. The man, or whatever he had become, rose to his feet, his movements sharp and unnatural. He turned his glowing gaze toward the group, his head twitching like a marionette on broken strings. "What do we do?" Jared hissed, gripping Emma's arm. Before she could answer, the deep, otherworldly voice returned, louder and colder than before. "The clock has struck 1. The first has fallen. Who will be next?" The masked figures reappeared, emerging from the shadows like phantoms. They encircled the group, their glowing eyes locking onto their prey. Emma's breath quickened. She grabbed Jared's hand, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her. "Run!" Part 7. The Labyrinth. Emma bolted, Jared close behind her as the room seemed to collapse around them. The masked figures moved in eerie unison, blocking the others from escaping. Their hollow gazes were fixed on Emma and Jared as they sprinted toward a side door, its brass handle glinting faintly in the dim light. "Where are we even going?" Jared shouted. "Away from here," Emma snapped, yanking the door open. They stumbled into a narrow corridor lined with warped wooden paneling. The air was thick and damp, carrying the faint scent of decay. Behind them, the sound of the masked figures grew louder, shuffling feet and the faint, rhythmic hum of the waltz. "Keep moving," Emma urged, dragging Jared forward. The corridor twisted and turned like a maze, splitting into forks and dead ends. Each path looked identical, the flickering sconces on the walls casting long, deceptive shadows. "This isn't right," Jared said, his voice trembling. "We should have hit the outside wall by now. This place is messing with us." Emma stopped at an intersection, her heart pounding. "Pick a direction," she said, trying to mask her rising panic. Jared pointed left and they took off again. The air grew colder with every step, and the faint sound of laughter echoed around them, low and guttural, as if the lodge itself were mocking them. They burst into a larger room, a sitting area with antique furniture draped in dust-covered sheets. A massive grandfather clock stood in the corner, its hands frozen at 1 o'clock. "Do you hear that?" Jared asked, his eyes darting around the room. Emma listened, her breath hitching. At first, there was nothing. Then she heard it, faint whispers, like a dozen voices speaking in unison. "Turn back. Stay. Midnight waits for all." "Let's go," Emma said, backing toward another doorway. But before they could leave, the clock's frozen hands began to move. The ticking was impossibly loud, reverberating in Emma's chest. Tick, tock, tick, tock. The hands sped up, spinning wildly until they reached 2 o'clock. The whispers stopped. Then came the scream. It wasn't human. It was a guttural, agonized wail that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The walls of the room shuddered, the wood groaning as though alive. "Run!" Emma shouted, grabbing Jared and pulling him through the nearest door. The corridor ahead was darker now, the sconces flickering and dying as they passed. The wail followed them, growing louder, almost tangible. They turned a corner and froze. The man who had fallen in the grand hall stood ahead of them, his body contorted and jerking unnaturally. The shattered remains of his mask clung to his face like a second skin, and his glowing eyes locked onto them. "Don't come any closer," Jared yelled, his voice cracking. The figure tilted its head, then lunged forward with inhuman speed. Emma grabbed a brass candlestick from a nearby table and swung it with all her might. The impact sent the figure staggering back, but it didn't fall. Instead, it straightened slowly, its head twisting at an impossible angle. "We can't fight it," Jared screamed. "Go!" Emma dropped the candlestick and ran, her legs burning as they barreled down another corridor. Ahead, she spotted a door with faint light seeping through the cracks. She pushed it open, and the two of them stumbled inside, slamming it shut behind them. The room was eerily calm, its walls lined with bookshelves filled with ancient, leather-bound tomes. In the center stood a large, ornate table, and on it lay an open book, its pages blank except for a single line written in crimson ink. "The second hour has begun. Will you survive the third?" Emma's hands trembled as she read the words aloud. The door behind them rattled violently, and the whispers returned, louder this time. "We're running out of time," Jared said, his voice barely audible. "What do we do now?" Emma stared at the book, her mind racing. "We find the rules to this game before it finds us." Part 8. The game revealed. The rattling at the door intensified, the whispers swelling into a cacophony that made Emma's skin crawl. She turned to Jared, her voice sharp with urgency. "Help me look for something, anything that can explain what's happening." The two of them scrambled around the room, rifling through the dusty shelves. The books were filled with strange symbols, unreadable text, and grotesque illustrations. None of them made sense. "This is useless," Jared exclaimed, slamming a book shut. Emma's gaze fell back to the open book on the table. The crimson ink shimmered faintly in the flickering light. As she leaned closer, more words began to appear on the page, scrawled as though by an invisible hand. "To escape the lodge, you must play. The clock strikes 12 for none who stray." "What does that mean?" Jared asked, peering over her shoulder. Emma's voice was tight. "It means this isn't just some sick prank. It's a ritual, a game with rules." The door groaned under the weight of something slamming against it, and the whispers shifted into a guttural growl. Jared grabbed a chair and wedged it under the handle. "We don't have time to decode this. What's the next move?" Emma's eyes darted back to the book as another line of text appeared. "Each hour demands a price. Choose wisely, or the lodge will choose for you." Her stomach sank. "A price," she whispered. "What kind of price?" Jared asked, his voice rising. As if in answer, the light in the room dimmed and the air grew colder. A new figure materialized in the corner, a masked woman in a tattered ball gown, her hollow eyes glowing faintly. She held a tray with two small objects, a dagger and an hourglass. The book's text shifted once more. "One must bleed or one must turn. The choice is yours." Emma's throat went dry. "It wants us to sacrifice something. Blood or something worse." "No way," Jared said, shaking his head. "I'm not playing along with this." The masked woman stepped forward, the tray steady in her hands. Her presence filled the room with an oppressive weight, making it hard to breathe. "What happens if we don't choose?" Jared asked, his voice trembling. As if in response, the door behind them splintered, and the guttural growls grew louder. Whatever was on the other side was moments away from breaking through. Emma's hands shook as she reached for the dagger. "We don't have a choice." "Emma, wait!" Jared started, but she cut him off. "We can't survive if we don't follow the rules." The moment her fingers closed around the dagger, the masked woman vanished and the growls stopped. The room fell deathly silent. Emma turned the blade in her hand, its edge gleaming unnaturally. "It just said blood, right? It doesn't have to be." Before she could finish, the door behind them exploded inward, and a twisted figure lunged through. Its face was a grotesque blend of human and mask, its limbs jerking like a puppet on frayed strings. "Emma, do it now!" Jared yelled, grabbing a broken table leg to fend off the creature. With no time to think, Emma pressed the dagger to her palm and slashed. Pain shot through her hand as warm blood dripped onto the floor. The effect was immediate. The creature froze mid-lunge, its glowing eyes flickering out like extinguished candles. Then it crumpled to the ground, dissolving into black ash. The whispers faded, leaving only the sound of Emma's ragged breathing. Jared dropped the table leg and turned to her. "Are you okay?" Emma nodded, clutching her bleeding hand. "It worked, but this was just 1 hour. There are still more to go." The book on the table shimmered again, its crimson text shifting to a new message. "The third hour approaches. Prepare for the dance of shadows." The door behind them slammed shut on its own, and the room began to change, its walls melting into darkness. Part 9. The Dance of Shadows. The walls of the room dissolved into a swirling black void, and Emma felt as though she were falling. Jared's hand gripped hers tightly as they landed with a jolt on a cold stone floor. They were in another room, but this one felt more ancient, as though it had been carved from the lodge itself. Massive stone pillars surrounded them, their surfaces etched with intricate, glowing symbols. In the center of the room was a raised platform, and on it stood a tall figure cloaked in shadows. Its mask was unlike the others, a smooth, featureless oval with two glowing eyes that pierced through the darkness. Before either of them could speak, the voice returned, deeper and more menacing than ever. The third hour begins. The dance of shadows requires your step. Fail, and the lodge will consume you. What now? Jared muttered, his voice shaky. As if in answer, shadows began to pool around their feet, swirling and stretching into humanoid shapes. The figures moved with a sinister grace, their bodies flickering like dying flames. Music filled the air, a slow, eerie melody that made the hairs on Emma's neck stand on end. The shadowy figures began to move, their steps deliberate and rhythmic, as though performing a ritual. "It's another dance," Emma whispered, dread creeping into her voice. "I'm not doing this again," Jared said, taking a step back. The shadowy figures stopped abruptly, their heads snapping toward him. Their eyeless faces locked onto him, and the temperature in the room plummeted. "Jared, wait," Emma said, grabbing his arm. "Look!" The platform in the center of the room glowed faintly, and more text appeared, written in light across the stone. "Match their steps, or your shadow will become theirs." Emma's breath hitched. "We have to dance. If we don't..." She trailed off, glancing at the shadowy figures. Their movements became erratic, twitching and jerking like broken marionettes. Jared clenched his fists. "This is insane." "It doesn't matter," Emma said, stepping forward. "We have to try." She watched the figures carefully, mimicking their slow, deliberate steps. As she moved, the glow from the platform grew brighter, and the shadowy figures seemed to hesitate. "Emma," Jared said, his voice filled with uncertainty. "Just follow me," she snapped, continuing the movements. Reluctantly, Jared began to move, his steps clumsy at first. The shadows swirled around them, their movements growing faster and more chaotic. The music shifted, its tempo rising. The figures' dance became more intricate, their limbs bending at impossible angles. Emma struggled to keep up, her heart racing as her feet stumbled over the complex steps. "I can't do this," Jared said, panic rising in his voice. "Yes, you can," Emma shouted. "Just focus." But as Jared missed a step, his shadow detached from his feet. It rose behind him, taking on a monstrous form with elongated limbs and glowing eyes. "Jared, watch out!" Emma screamed. The shadow lunged at him, wrapping its inky tendrils around his body. He thrashed and yelled, but the more he struggled, the tighter the shadow's grip became. Emma's mind raced. She couldn't lose him, not now. "Let him go!" she shouted, stepping forward. The shadow paused, tilting its head as if considering her demand. Then the platform glowed brighter, and new words appeared. "Sacrifice or salvation. The choice must be made." Emma's blood ran cold. "No, I'm not choosing between us." The shadow tightened its grip on Jared, his face contorting in pain. "Emma," he gasped, his voice barely audible. Tears streamed down her face as she stepped onto the platform. "Take me instead." The shadow released Jared instantly, slithering toward her like a living storm. She braced herself, but just before it reached her, the light from the platform exploded outward, engulfing the room. When the light faded, the shadow was gone, and Jared was on the ground, gasping for air. "Emma, he croaked, scrambling to his feet. "I'm fine," she said, though her body felt weak as though something vital had been drained from her. The voice returned, its tone colder than ever. "The hour ends, but the cost is paid. The fourth hour awaits." The room shifted again, the pillars crumbling into darkness. Emma and Jared stood side by side, their breaths heavy as they prepared for what was coming next. Part 10. The Midnight Toll. The world around them solidified into the grand hall once more, but it was utterly transformed. The chandeliers hung crooked, their candles burning with black flames. The walls pulsed like a living thing, and the air was thick with the metallic scent of blood. In the center of the room stood the massive clock, its hands now pointed to 11, ticking with deliberate slowness toward midnight. Emma clutched Jared's arm. "This is it, the final hour." Before Jared could respond, the haunting waltz returned, louder and more distorted than ever. The masked figures emerged from the shadows, encircling them in a wide, unbroken ring. The voice echoed through the hall, heavy with finality. "Midnight nears. The price must be paid in full. Will you leave, or will you remain part of the lodge forever?" "What do they mean, part of the lodge?" Jared asked, his voice shaking. Emma's mind raced. The rules of the game had been cryptic, but every hour demanded a choice, a sacrifice. She glanced at the clock, its hands ticking inexorably closer to midnight. The figures parted, revealing the featureless masked figure from the dance of shadows. It stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate, and held out a hand. Another book materialized on the floor in front of them, its cover adorned with intricate carvings of a clock. Crimson text began to write itself across the pages. "Only one may leave. One must remain. The lodge demands a soul to complete the ritual." "No," Emma whispered, shaking her head. "There has to be another way." The masked figure tilted its head as if amused. It raised its hand and the clock began to chime, each toll reverberating like a hammer against their chests. Dong. "What do we do?" Jared shouted, panic taking over. Emma stared at the book, her mind battling the impossible decision. One of them had to stay, or they'd both be trapped here forever. Dong. "Emma!" Jared's voice broke through her spiraling thoughts. She turned to him, tears in her eyes. "I'm not letting you do this." "And I'm not letting you," he said firmly. "But we don't have time to argue." Dong. The masked figures began to move closer, their glowing eyes fixed on the pair. The air grew colder, the oppressive energy of the lodge bearing down on them. Emma looked at the book, then at Jared. Her heart ached, but she knew what she had to do. "You have people waiting for you, Jared, a life outside this place." "And you don't?" he demanded, his voice rising. Dong. The final chime was near. Emma reached for the book, but Jared grabbed her hand, stopping her. "We'll find another way," he said desperately. "There isn't another way," she yelled, tears streaming down her face. Dong. The final toll began, slower and deeper than the others. The masked figures closed in, their presence suffocating. Emma pulled her hand free and slammed her palm onto the book. "I choose." But before she could finish, Jared pushed her away and placed his hand on the book instead. "It's me. I'll stay." "No!" Emma screamed, lunging for him, but the masked figures held her back, their cold hands like iron. Jared looked at her, his face calm despite the tears in his eyes. "You fought harder than anyone I've ever known. You deserve to leave." The clock struck midnight, and the lodge trembled violently. Jared's body began to dissolve into shimmering particles of light, the masked figures bowing as he was absorbed into the walls of the lodge. "No," Emma sobbed, collapsing to the floor. The voice returned, softer now, almost soothing. "The ritual is complete. The lodge is satisfied." The room brightened, and Emma found herself outside the lodge, the icy wind biting at her face. She was alone, the massive structure looming behind her, silent and foreboding. As she stumbled away, the lodge's lights flickered one last time before fading into darkness. The sound of a distant chime echoed through the woods, and Emma whispered into the night, "I'll come back for you, Jared. I promise." And with that, she disappeared into the shadows, leaving the lodge and its horrors behind.